In this video, we'll be starting with the shell of a project and end up with a 3D scene of something resembling a dungeon. But before we jump into the coding, I thought it'd be a good idea to take a step back and think about the goals of the project. The first goal is trying to recreate a retro-style dungeon. So this would be something very similar to Ultima 1 or Wizardy, two games which were made in the very early 80s and were sort of the forefathers of every other game that you've played since. The next goal is really just to level set, in that we're just going to be creating the skeleton of a game. We're not trying to make a full-fledged game here, but really focusing on the basic display and a little bit of the movement. And the last goal is to learn W. I think it's a really great library and framework, and it'll be useful for any sort of code golf competitions such as JavaScript 13K. So the features we'll look to build are very basic. Cardinal movement, we're going to be moving forward, turning, and moving backwards. That's about it. We'll have walls and doors, and we'll display some enemies and items, although we probably won't do anything with them. They'll just be for display purposes. And to kind of recreate that retro dungeon display, we'll look to try to make a limited color palette, maybe even going as far as just black and white pixels, and keep it as pixely as possible. So we're going to end up shrinking down the dimensions of our canvas. So I think it's important to also think about what the non-goals are. So what are some things that we don't really care about accomplishing? First of all, this will be unscripted and unprofessional. The code might be messy. I'm probably going to jump into things without planning them out too far. This whole project is really just for fun, so I'm probably going to just pick and choose best practices without a whole lot of thought. So keep that in mind when you're following along. The second non-goal is that I'm not really looking to be pixel perfect. I know for Ultima 1 it was made for the Apple II. I'm going to try to get something close to the display, but it doesn't have to be exact. I'm not looking for the exact dimensions, an exact reproduction of the games. And the third non-goal is that we're not making a complete game. This is really just repeating goal number 2. We're making a skeleton of a game. There won't be combat or AI or any of that. And the last non-goal is we're not making a framework. Although this one I know will be kind of hard for me to follow. I tend to like to make my code as reusable as possible, which almost always ends up with me making some kind of framework for my game. But we'll see if I can follow along with that. And last, let's look at some bonus features. Some ideas that I am hoping I can maybe fit into this, but I'm not really going to promise. It would be nice to have some kind of ladders so we can go from floor to floor. Also, random level generation would be pretty nice. Having animated player movements would be a nice feature to add. And some sort of bobbing animation for enemies so that they're not just static images on the screen. Adding in some lighting could be a possibility. It doesn't really fit with the retro display, but it could be something that we might be able to add. And the last feature is culling. So I'm going to end up just kind of rendering everything. I'm probably not worrying too much about performance. But those are things that maybe we could look into if it makes sense. If you want to see more of this project and want to see it go all the way to completion, then please like and subscribe. That really helps the videos and helps me know that these are videos that you want to keep seeing. Step 1 is to start with a basic W project already set up. So if you haven't watched my previous video, go take a look at setting up a W WebGL project for beginners, kind of take you through step by step, putting together the package JSON and putting together a world and making sure that we have the W library in here. in ESM format. I'm assuming that you have all that stuff to start. All this code is open source on GitHub. So here's the basic setup from our previous tutorial. Just showing a bunch of shapes. I've changed the colors around a little bit, but it's still just basically a bunch of shapes on a background. Step 2, we want to think through what actually is a dungeon and how can we represent it in our data or our code. This site at rpgclassics.com shows a good representation of the dungeons that you'll see in Ultima 1. You'll see they're very basic. I believe they're 9 by 9. There will always be 5 hallways, and there will be a way to go up and a way to go down. And to add some randomness, there will be some hidden doors, doorways, some barriers, and some monsters along the way. And these dungeons are generated randomly, but they all end up very similar to each other. If we take a look at the description of a dungeon here on the Ultima Codex website, you'll see they're deep and dark places in the game filled with monsters and treasure, and they're usually composed of several levels, usually 8, with ladders as a way to move up and down. Dungeons will have many different monsters and traps and puzzles. As we've already decided, we won't be having all of these features, but they're good to keep in mind when thinking about the dungeon. For now, I think it's good to just concentrate on what we see here. The dungeon is basically a grid. It's a 2-dimensional grid, it's square, and it has a number of features in it. We'll want to make sure that the dungeon has walls around the whole outside and a bunch of walls on the inside to provide some kind of maze-like experience for the user. Now, returning to the code, how do we want to represent that in the game? I think wherever possible, you want to represent things just in data. Having as much of your game in data files rather than in code will actually make it really easy to modify the game and can make it really easy to take your game and create a new game from it, which can be really helpful when you're working on game jams. So let's start by making a JSON file for the dungeons. So we'll start with just one property of the dungeon, and that is the floor. And in there, I'm making an array of strings that represent the layout of the floor. The array helps us to be able to easily draw the dungeon in the file. Right now we don't have any editing tools, so we'll be making the modifications right here in the JSON file. Having the floor data laid out in a grid will help us visualize it and make edits. So we'll import that dungeon data into our world file and just spit it out to the console to make sure everything's working correctly. You'll see some funky syntax for assert type JSON. That's just needed to tell the browser how to import JSON data. And there we see the data. Next, we want to get the dungeon data into a more usable format and get it rendering to the canvas. We want to give some meaning to the characters we're using in the floor data, so we create a legend lookup for them. For now, we only care about how they will get rendered. This is an approach I've used before. I created something very similar for a previous project, which resulted in a framework called Dungeon Boots. If you're curious, check it out on GitHub. creating a makeBlockArray method, which will use the floor data and create an array of only the blocks that need to be rendered. We also need some methods to go from the index to XY coordinates. Finally, we import the dungeon class and feed it the dungeon data. Now it's time to render the blocks by creating a cube for each one. Oh yeah, I forgot these rotations. And let's zoom out quite a bit. That looks like the boring dungeon that we built. So you'll see there's a couple problems here. One is it seems to be flipped around in a way that we wouldn't expect when we first look at the data. But if we actually take a look at the W framework and back again at the grid, we'll see we have the Y direction going up, the X going to the right. But when we take a look at the data that we put together, it's going X direction this way, Y direction down. So that obviously won't quite work. Looks like we'll just have to change some calculations for the X and Y. And there we've fixed the dimension issue. Now the Y's are going up and the X is going across, but there still seems to be a problem here, right here. In order to take a better look at that, let's move the dungeon so it's more centered. There we go, that looks a little better. In order to figure out what's going on here, one fun thing to do might be to change the colors based on the row. I think that might give us some insights, and it'll look nice anyways. So I believe this is the problem. I was expecting the size was going to be 12 by 12. Maybe we made some kind of error here. There we go. Somewhere in our code we're assuming a square shape. We'll have to take a look at that because obviously you might want to have shapes besides a square. But there we go. It says hi. It's looking good. We're going to do a couple things in here. First, we're going to check the data from the floor and make sure it makes sense, and maybe do a little bit more complicated calculations on the size. So we purposely made it a bit longer than it was before, and it looks like we fixed the calculation. But I want to do one step more and make sure that we can't mess up the dimensions on the x-axis. Right now, we're just looking at the first row of the floor to figure out the x length. So that should stop us from making mistakes accidentally. We might want to expand this and make it a little bit more lenient. If one part of the dungeon is a little bit longer than another, then we can really just fill in any of that extra space with blank space. The last step is we want to add in a player character. So we could add them in as a block, but I think the player character is going to be special enough that we want to have it separate. And now we can see the hero sphere. We're going to call that good enough for now. The blue cubes are pretty boring, so let's give them a little bit of color. Let's try giving this dungeon a floor. For that, we'll just use a simple plane. We can see here that it is intersecting where we kind of don't want it to be. So it looks like the plane is unfortunately a square, but that's okay. I think it might be better to actually have a single plane underneath each of the floor tiles. That way, if we want to give it any kind of texture, it might just work out a little bit easier. Let's give that a try. This map is basically unnecessary right now, but I think later on it might be useful. We might want to have things that are combinations of shapes and yet still refer to them as a single string in the render as. So as you can see, we have the individual floor planes here, but the color is a little off, makes it hard to see. That's much better. This step is completely unnecessary, but I just want to make it a little bit prettier. And that wraps it up for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video.